Welcome to Sleepy Stories. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a true mystery history never explained. A story from 1849 about Edgar Allan Poe. Relax, listen closely, and let the words guide you, because this is a quiet horror, one that listens back. Baltimore, United States, autumn of 1849. The city was alive in the way a body remains alive after the soul has already decided to leave. Streets breathed. Walls remembered. Beneath the sound of carriage wheels and drunken laughter, something older listened with immense patience. Edgar Allan Poe did not wake up that morning knowing it would be the last time the world would see him as a living man. He woke up knowing something else had already decided for him. The air in his rented and damp wood. His clothes were unfamiliar, stiff with dried mud, as if he had slept inside the memory of a grave rather than a bed. When he moved, pain answered from places he did not remember injuring. When he tried to recall the night before, his thoughts slid away, leaving only one sensation behind: a sound. Not ringing, not silence, something in between. Poe sat up slowly, heart hammering, and understood with terrifying clarity that the fear he had written about all his life was no longer imagination. It had learned his name. Baltimore did not announce its secrets loudly. It preferred to let them sink slowly into the bones of those who lived there long enough. Edgar Allan Poe had lived there just long enough to feel the city breathing beneath him, and not long enough to escape it. He stepped out into the street as morning light struggled through a sky the color of old bruises. People passed him without recognition, though a few slowed, staring as if they sensed something unfinished clinging to him. Poe adjusted his coat, unsettled by the certainty that he had already walked these streets recently under very different circumstances. As he moved, fragments returned. A tavern, voices thick with alcohol, a hand gripping his arm too firmly. Then darkness, not the kind brought by sleep, but the kind that presses inward from all sides. Beneath those memories was a sound again, faint but undeniable, like metal remembering its purpose. He reached the harbor by instinct. Water had always steadied him, but today it reflected nothing familiar. The surface rippled as if disturbed from below, and for a moment Poe imagined bells hanging beneath the waves, ringing soundlessly to creatures that did not require air. He turned away, shaken by how natural the thought felt. By afternoon he was exhausted, though he could not recall doing anything deserving of such weariness. He returned to his lodging house, where the landlady stared at him as one might stare at a man who had knocked after his own funeral. She crossed herself without comment and handed him a letter that had arrived earlier that day. The envelope bore no return address. Inside, written in precise ink, were only a few words telling him that what had been begun beneath the city could not be abandoned halfway. Poe felt his pulse quicken as he read the sentence again and again, each repetition altering its meaning slightly, as if the words themselves were adjusting to his understanding. That night, sleep came reluctantly. When it did, it carried him downward. He dreamed of stone steps spiraling beneath Baltimore, of rooms carved into earth where men whispered instead of spoke. In the center of one such room stood a bell, blackened with age, suspended above a slab stained darker than rust. He knew without being told that the bell was not meant to save anyone. He woke before dawn with his heart racing and his mouth dry. The sound lingered in his ears, no longer imagined. Somewhere far below, a bell rang once, deliberate and calm, as if acknowledging that he was awake again. Poe sat in the darkness until the city stirred. He did not pray. He had the strange sense that whatever was listening had already heard enough. When daylight finally arrived, it brought with it a certainty he could not explain. Whatever had happened to him was not finished. It had merely paused, waiting for him to notice that the story had already begun. The second day unfolded with the unnatural calm that often follows a storm no one remembers witnessing. Poe moved through Baltimore like a man out of phase with the world around him. Conversations reached his ears a second too late. Footsteps echoed before they landed. Even his shadow seemed reluctant to keep pace, stretching and shrinking as if unsure of his substance. He tried to write, believing the act might anchor him. Words had always obeyed him when people did not. Yet each sentence he set down felt borrowed, as though he were copying from a text written somewhere beneath the city. The ink darkened unnaturally fast, bleeding into the paper with a hunger that unsettled him. When he paused, listening, he realized the scratching of his pen matched the rhythm he had heard in his sleep. By midday, curiosity overcame dread. Poe followed the sensation, pulling at him through narrow streets and past brick buildings whose foundations sank deeper than their age suggested. He noticed markings and faint symbols etched into stone near cellar doors and alley walls. Bells, crudely scratched, some with lines through them, others circled as if emphasized. No one else seemed to see them. He stopped before a shuttered house that exuded an unmistakable gravity. The windows were sealed, yet there seeped through the cracks, cold and smelling of earth. Poe pressed his ear to the door. At first there was nothing. Then came the sound, soft, patient, unmistakable. A bell ringing far below, measured not in panic but in time. Footsteps approached behind him. Poe straightened quickly as a man passed, eyes fixed forward, jaw clenched as though repeating a prayer. When the man reached the corner, the ringing ceased. Poe remained frozen long after, understanding that the sound was selective. It waited to be heard. That evening, a letter appeared on his desk without knock or warning. It informed him, in courteous language, that his continued survival depended on discretion. The writer praised his imagination and suggested that imagination, properly guided, could serve the greater good. At the bottom of the page, pressed faintly into the paper, was the outline of a bell. Sleep brought no rest. He dreamed of men awakening beneath soil, fingers bleeding as they rang bells tied to their wrists. Above them, listeners leaned close to the ground, debating whether the sound was worthy of response. Poe woke gasping, convinced that the dream had not ended when his eyes opened. At dawn, the ringing returned, closer now, as if something beneath Baltimore had adjusted its distance to him. Poe sat at the edge of his bed, shaking, and accepted what his mind had resisted since waking in that unfamiliar room. The bell was not a memory. It was an invitation. The third day arrived without sunrise. Clouds pressed low over Baltimore, turning morning into an extended dusk. Poe welcomed the dimness. Bright light felt dishonest now, like a lie the city told itself so it could continue functioning. He followed the pull again, no longer pretending it was coincidence. His steps carried him toward neighborhoods he had never written about, streets absent from polite maps. The houses that leaned inward, brick faces scarred and damp, their foundations older than their upper floors. Poe sensed that these buildings had been altered from below, expanded downward the way roots expand, quietly and without permission. Near one such house, he found a cellar door partially ajar. The metal hinges were polished from recent use. A smell rose from the opening, thick with earth and something sharper beneath it. Poe hesitated only a moment before descending the narrow steps. Each footfall seemed to sink into the stone, as though the stairs themselves were reluctant to let him pass. Below, the air grew still. The ringing was clearer here, not louder, but more precise. It came from a small room lit by a single oil lamp. At the center stood a wooden table. Upon it lay a man bound tightly, his eyes wide, chest rising in shallow, frantic breaths. A bell was tied to his finger with black thread. The man rang it the moment he saw Poe. The sound sliced through the room. Poe staggered back, horror flooding him as footsteps echoed from somewhere beyond the walls. The bound man tried to speak, but terror swallowed his voice. Poe did not wait to see who would answer the bell. He fled upward, heart pounding, the ringing chasing him until he burst into daylight. He did not stop running until the sound faded into memory. When he finally slowed, he understood with sickening clarity what he had witnessed. The bell was not an emergency signal. It was a test, and someone was always listening. That night, Poe wrote feverishly. He wrote of men who measured fear as carefully as physicians measured blood. He wrote of cities that hid their cruelties underground so they could claim innocence above. As he wrote, the bell rang intermittently, responding not to sound but to thought. Near midnight, a shadow passed across his window. Poe looked up to see a raven perched on the lamppost outside. It was larger than any bird he had seen, its feathers absorbing the weak light. When it spoke, its voice was low and unhurried. "You were not meant to intervene," it said. Poe swallowed. "Then why show me?" "So you would understand your role," the raven replied. "You observe, you record, you do not stop the mechanism." Poe felt a cold resolve settle in his chest. "I refuse," he said. The raven regarded him silently. Somewhere deep beneath the city, a bell rang once, firm and displeased. Poe realized then that refusal itself had been anticipated. When the bird finally flew away, Dawn was breaking weakly through the clouds. Poe sat alone with his manuscript, knowing that what he had seen could no longer be unwritten. The bell had not only mocked him, it had begun to educate him. The fourth day broke with rain, a thin, persistent drizzle that soaked Baltimore until the bricks darkened and the streets gleamed like freshly opened wounds. Poe welcomed the cold. It dulled his thoughts just enough to keep them from splintering entirely. He did not leave his room at first. He sat at the small table, staring at the manuscript, aware that the pages now seemed heavier, as though each word added weight not just to the paper but to the space around it. When he touched the ink, it felt faintly warm, and he pulled his hand back as if burned. The ringing returned in fragments that day. Not a single clear sound, but echoes layered atop one another, as though multiple bells were being tested at different depths. Poe pressed his palms to his ears, but the sound did not travel through air. It arrived fully formed inside his skull. By afternoon, there was a knock. This one disturbed the air. 3 men stood in the hallway when Poe opened the door. They were dressed plainly, but their movements were precise, economical, the way surgeons move before an incision. One carried a leather case. Another held a notebook already half filled with writing. They did not introduce themselves. "You are falling behind," the man with the notebook said calmly. "The interval between observations is lengthening." Poe felt a chill unrelated to the rain. "I am not your chronicler," he replied. The third man smiled, almost kindly. "You are exactly that. You simply misunderstand the nature of the record." They stepped inside without invitation. Poe noticed then that their boots were clean, free of mud despite the weather. The leather case was opened on his table, revealing instruments he did not recognize, delicate and precise, each marked with small engraved bells. "We have studied the limits of fear," the notebook man continued. "But language is the only instrument that consistently survives the test. You give the bell its memory." Poe's throat tightened, and the men beneath the houses. A pause, measured, necessary variables. The ringing surged then, sharp and sudden. One of the men flinched. Poe saw it clearly, and the knowledge settled heavily in his chest. They were afraid of the bell, too. After they left, Poe locked the door and leaned against it, shaking. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows in uneven rhythms that began to resemble the sound he could no longer escape. He understood now that the society did not fully control what they had built. They only guided it, like handlers guiding a blind animal that had learned to recognize their voices. As night fell, the raven returned, perching inside the room for the first time. Its weight bowed the back of the chair slightly, as though it were heavier than its form suggested. Poe noticed small metal threads braided into its talons, each one faintly vibrating. "You see further now," the raven said. "I see enough," Poe answered. "They are using me." The raven tilted its head. "They are being used as well. The bell requires witnesses. Without you, it will select another." Poe laughed softly, the sound breaking. "Then let it choose." The raven's eyes darkened. "It already has." That night, Poe dreamed not of burial, but of writing endlessly while the city sank inch by inch into the earth, every sentence driving it deeper. When he woke, the manuscript was open beside him, a new paragraph written in his hand, describing the dream before he could speak it aloud. The bell rang once, not in approval, in warning. The 5th day began with an absence. No ringing greeted Poe when he opened his eyes. No echo lingered in the walls. No vibration trembled beneath the floorboards. The silence felt deliberate, constructed with care, like a pause held too long in a piece of music. It unsettled him more than any sound could have. He rose slowly, aware that his body felt lighter, almost hollow. The city outside seemed distant, muffled, as though Baltimore itself were holding its breath. When he stepped into the street, he noticed how few people met his gaze. Those who did quickly looked away, hands tightening around coats or prayer beads. It was a look reserved for men who reminded others of something they wished to forget. As he walked, memories not his own began to surface. Flashes of men lying beneath boards, fingernails split, lungs burning. Moments of hope crushed by delayed footsteps. Poe staggered, clutching a wall, realizing that the bell was no longer merely educating him. It was sharing its archive. By noon, he found himself standing before a church long abandoned. Its doors hung crooked, its bell tower empty. The pull was undeniable. Inside, dust coated the pews, yet the floor bore fresh marks, scuffed by recent movement. Behind the altar, a trapdoor gaped open. The descent felt familiar. Below, the chamber was larger than any he had seen before. Bells of varying sizes hung from iron frames, each labeled in careful script. Dates, names, durations. Poe read until his vision swam. Some names were crossed out, some circled, some left untouched, as though awaiting conclusion. At the center of the room stood the largest bell, its surface darkened not by age, but by use. Poe felt its presence press against his thoughts, heavy and intimate. He understood then that the bell did not measure fear alone. It measured resistance. Footsteps sounded behind him. The society emerged from the shadows, their expression stripped of ceremony. The undertaker spoke first. "You have learned enough," he said. "Now you must decide whether knowledge ends with you." Poe turned to face them. "This will not stop," he said quietly. "No," the man agreed, "but it can be guided." The bell rang softly, not to interrupt, but to listen. In that moment, Poe realized a truth history would never record. He was not meant to survive this encounter. He was meant to be integrated, a living conduit between language and terror, a mind capable of translating the bell's judgments into something the world could consume without recognizing itself in the reflection. He thought of his stories, of premature burials, of beating hearts, of men driven mad by guilt and sound. He understood now where those ideas had come from. They had been rehearsals. Poe stepped closer to the bell. Its surface reflected him faintly, distorted, as though already remembering him. The society watched in silence, fear flickering behind their composure. Somewhere above, Baltimore went on living. Below, the bell waited, and Edgar Allan Poe listened back. The sixth day did not begin in Baltimore. It began beneath it. Poe awoke to stone above him and her pressing close on all sides. For a moment, instinct screamed that he had been buried alive, that the bell had finally claimed him as it had claimed so many others. His breath came shallow and sharp, scraping his throat as panic threatened to overwhelm him. Then he realized he could move. He sat up slowly, his head brushing against a low ceiling reinforced with old beams. A single lantern burned nearby, its flame steady, uncaring. The air smelled of soil, oil, and something metallic that clung to the tongue. Poe's body ached, but it was a dull ache of exhaustion, not injury. He was not a prisoner. He was a guest. The chamber opened into a corridor carved directly through packed earth and brick. As Poe stood, the ringing returned, not loud, not urgent, but close, intimate. It did not come from one direction. It surrounded him, vibrating through the walls, through his bones, through the spaces between his thoughts. He walked. The corridor widened into a vast underground hall, larger than any church above ground. Stone pillars rose like ribs, supporting a ceiling blackened by age and smoke. Along the walls, alcoves held names carved carefully into plaques. Poe recognized many of them. Writers, philosophers, inventors, minds history remembered for brilliance, madness, or both. At the center of the hall stood the bell. Up close, it was immense. Its surface was etched with words instead of symbols, sentences, fragments, half-formed thoughts. Poe leaned closer and felt his breath catch as he recognized his own writing among them, mingled with lines from works never published, ideas abandoned mid-thought, screams disguised as poetry. The society waited nearby, no longer hiding. There was no ceremony now, no pretense of authority. They stood like attendants before a force they could not command. "You have crossed the final threshold," the undertaker said quietly. "The bell has accepted you." Poe's voice was hoarse. "Accepted me as what?" "As its interpreter," another replied. "The bell does not speak in words. It speaks in pressure, in endurance. You give that meaning." The ringing deepened, resonating through the chamber until Poe felt it behind his eyes. Images flooded him, countless minds tested, broken, refined. Some had rung too soon, some too late. The bell remembered them all. Poe understood then why history would find him days later delirious, dressed in clothes not his own, speaking fragments of sense and nonsense alike. He would not be lost. He would be leaking. When he finally stepped back into the streets of Baltimore, dawn was breaking. The city looked unchanged, ordinary. No one could see what now echoed inside him. The bell did not follow him above ground. It did not need to. Edgar Allan Poe carried its voice with him, stitched into language, into rhythm, into every word he would ever write again. And long after his body failed, long after his death was recorded as a mystery, the bell would continue to ring. Not beneath the city, but inside those who listened closely enough to his stories. The seventh day found him among people again, and that was the cruelest test of all. Baltimore moved around him with renewed confidence, as if the city sensed that its secret had been safely resealed. Markets reopened, taverns filled, laughter returned to corners that had felt hollow only days before. Poe walked through it carrying the quiet certainty that he no longer belonged entirely to the surface world. He became aware of small distortions. When he spoke, listeners leaned closer than necessary, brows knitting as if straining to hear something beneath his words. When he stopped speaking, conversations faltered, leaving behind an uncomfortable pause that no one knew how to fill. Poe realized with a tightening chest that the bell was not ringing aloud anymore. It was modulating him. He visited a physician that afternoon, driven by the fragile hope that a name might lessen what he felt. The man listened, examined him, asked careful questions, and wrote nothing of substance. When Poe described the sound, the pressure, the certainty of being observed, the physician's eyes flicked briefly toward the floor before returning to his patient's face. "You have been exhausted," the physician said at last. "Your mind is overstimulated. Rest is essential." Poe understood the lie for what it was. The doctor had heard stories like this before. He had learned, as the city had learned, which truths were safer left undocumented. As evening fell, Poe wandered toward the outskirts of Baltimore, where the houses thinned and the ground softened. He felt drawn to the edges now, to places where foundations gave way to soil. At one such boundary, he saw men digging. They worked quietly, methodically, their tools striking earth in steady rhythms. No one rang a bell. No one called for help. Poe stood at a distance, watching until one of the men looked up and met his gaze. The man's expression held no fear, only recognition. The digging stopped. Poe turned away before he could learn what they were preparing. That night, he tried not to write. He sat with his hands folded, staring at the manuscript as though it were an open mouth waiting to be fed. Hours passed. The silence thickened until it felt viscous, pressing against his temples. When the first sentence formed in his mind, it arrived with the force of a command. He wrote, not because he wished to, but because the alternative felt like suffocation. The words flowed differently now. They were sharper, more economical, stripped of ornament. Fear was no longer described. It was implied. When he finished, the ringing returned for the briefest instant, not as sound but as alignment. Poe felt something settle into place. Satisfied, he understood then what the bell ultimately demanded. Continuity. As long as the stories endured, as long as readers leaned in and listened closely, the mechanism would never truly fall silent. Outside his window, the city slept easily. And somewhere deep below, something ancient learned how to hide in plain sight. The eighth day was the one history tried to summarize. It began with Poe being found where he should not have been. He was discovered at dawn on the outskirts of the city, collapsed near a public house he had never frequented, wearing clothes that did not belong to him. Mud caked the hems of his trousers. His shoes were mismatched. Those who gathered whispered his name with a peculiar tone reserved for men already halfway transformed into stories. When he was lifted, his body reacted too slowly, as though his nerves were receiving instruction from a great distance. His eyes opened and closed without focus. He spoke, but not in full sentences. Fragments slipped from his mouth, dates, names, durations, delivered with the precision of a ledger being read aloud. At the hospital, attendants struggled to place him within any familiar diagnosis. Drunkenness was suggested, then dismissed. Fever was considered, then abandoned. Poe's pulse was steady, his breathing calm. His distress was not physical. It was structural. Visitors came and went. Some claimed to know him. Others insisted they had only read him. All left unsettled, reporting the same sensation, the feeling of having heard something important just before forgetting it. A physician attempted to document Poe's speech. Midway through transcription, the ink pooled strangely on the page, bleeding through the paper as if drawn downward. The physician tore the sheet free and burned it without explanation. By nightfall, Poe grew quieter. The ringing returned, not within him, but around him. Those standing nearby later disagreed about what they heard. Some reported a distant bell. Others insisted it was nothing more than the hum of the city settling into sleep. No two accounts matched. Poe opened his eyes once more and looked toward the ceiling. His lips moved. "It is complete," he whispered. At that moment, beneath the streets of Baltimore, a bell was crossed out. The following morning, Edgar Allan Poe was pronounced dead. The cause was listed, revised, amended, and disputed in the days that followed. Alcohol, congestion of the brain, exposure. None satisfied. None were meant to. What remained were the writings. They circulated slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. Readers described a peculiar effect. The sense that the stories were not revealing horrors, but reminding them of something they already knew and had chosen to forget. Years later, renovations beneath the city would uncover sealed chambers and empty frames where bells had once hung. No records explained their removal. No tools were found. Only scratches remained on the stone, marks consistent with listening. There was no ninth day. At least, not one that could be assigned to Edgar Allan Poe. After the funeral, Baltimore resumed its habits with remarkable speed. The newspapers moved on. The taverns found new stories. Poe's name settled into the category reserved for the dead who were already halfway myth. His grave became a place of brief pauses rather than long mourning. People stood, reflected, and left unsure what they had expected to feel. Yet the bell did not end with burial. It surfaced in subtle ways. In the sudden popularity of stories that lingered uncomfortably after being read, in the quiet dread that followed certain sentences, even when readers could not explain why. Teachers remarked that students hesitated before closing Poe's books, as though listening for something that might object. Archivists noticed discrepancies. Letters attributed to Poe appeared in collections without clear provenance. Marginal notes surfaced in unfamiliar handwriting, expanding on themes of confinement, sound, and endurance. No two copies of the same manuscript seemed to match perfectly. Variations were minor, easily dismissed, but they accumulated. In the years that followed, renovations beneath Baltimore continued. Cellars deepened. Foundations were reinforced. Workers occasionally reported finding hollow spaces where there should have been none. These reports were logged, filed, and quietly forgotten. No bells were recovered. What was recovered were impressions, indentations in stone that matched no known instrument, scratches that suggested repeated contact, not impact, as though something had been leaned against the walls for long periods. Engineers dismissed them as stress marks. No one asked why they were all positioned at standing height. Far from Baltimore, readers experienced a final consequence without ever knowing its source. Some felt compelled to read Poe aloud, discovering that the cadence altered the room itself. Others reported dreams of narrow spaces and distant sounds, dreams that faded upon waking but left a residue of unease throughout the day. The bell had learned restraint. It no longer required burial chambers or underground holes. It lived where language lived. It existed in rhythm, implication, and pause. Each retelling tuned it further, sharpening its ability to endure without being named. This was a true function Poe had served, not as victim, not as martyr, but as calibration. History would remember his death as a mystery because mystery was the only form that could contain what followed.